So this morning, I was here attending to some other presentations from some of you. Some of you introduced just some ideas, some parts of the process in your projects, and at least 3 of you presented like slides and more in-depth introduction of the projects, and that confirmed what I already knew, which is that indeed the things that I've been doing for years outside academia are very connected, very similar in many ways to the things you are doing now, right? It's because there is this obsession for thinking culture and thinking text and thinking reality through data and using tools that are also cultural in the sense that they also produce images, text, etc., creating this interesting feedback loop in which culture talking about feedback loops. And indeed, we saw that in some of the projects, right? The moment you start analyzing reality through data, you start also affecting reality, and that creates these interesting situations. I've been working with networks a lot, right? It was something that interested me from the beginning, and actually, I will say that my first data visualization project was directly with networks. And the thing that happened with that project is that I actually started working on 2 different projects. One was about genes and interactions among genes, and the other was about different religious and non-religious parties in Colombia. And for some reason, the way the data came, or the way I messaged the data, or whatever, the 2 data sets came out being quite similar, and then the visualization was almost the same. And that amazed me. Like, how is that 2 very distinct realities end up in kind of similar analytical devices or images? So network analysis and network visualization has this magic thing of being a sort of transportation means to travel through all sorts of knowledge aspects of reality. And I think what I just said represents very, very well what you do here as well. Like, there's no aspect of reality that cannot be touched by this kind of approach. And that's, I think, the reason I work on this. I work on data. It's not so much that I like visualization, it's more that I like the things that are behind that data that I use for visualization, that it allows me to never be just part of one single thing in the world, that I can explore the whole world, or at least this is how it feels. Okay, so no more talk, I'm gonna be presenting stuff. But the other thing that I would like to say is that before going into the topic of network storytelling, is that today I don't want just to show like work and ideas and things I've done, but more share with all of you big questions and challenges and even failures in a way, and things that I feel I still have not solved. Like in particular around the subject of network storytelling, it's like, for me, it's like a promise still not fulfilled. And I will be talking about that, and that's why the first part of today's session, it will be me presenting the stuff, but the second part will be all talking, and I will be putting some questions, so for all of us to try to shed some light on them, right? So the structure of this talk is, or this presentation is, that I will make the argument that visualization is a language from different angles and perspectives. We're gonna make different arguments here. I'm going to talk about efforts I've made to break linearity through data analysis and visualization. and then go into the specific problem of networks as devices for telling stories and difficulties and challenges around that. And then some questions, and with that I will end. So let's go to the idea that visualization is a language. Yes, there is in the Zoom there is a delay, and it's a little bit jumpy, but I think it will. So language has properties such as it is productive, generative, and combinatorial. These are only a few properties that linguists know about all languages. I will try to show how visualization has at least some of these. Right? And I will start with a sort of thought exercise or experiment, which is starting just with 2 numbers, which is a very small database, but it's a database, right? 7537, and invite you to think a little bit about how many ways and which ways you can think it's possible to visualize this small database, right? The first example I put here is just writing or number notation, and I choose, well, our so-called Arabic number notation, and then Babylonian, right? But there are many more notations for numbers, but this is still a mechanism to convey numbers. So it's a visualization, right? And you can see there are others on the right, but if you start thinking about other ways, you will see there are many options, right? Let's see some. The one we are looking now here is quite, let's say, naive. It's 1 square per unit. Then it might happen that these squares represent things. So we are putting a sort of layer of semantics over here. And now we are conveying a reality that involves humans, it seems. Right? Then we have technologies such as this one to pack and organize numbers following some clever mathematical ideas that we started using some thousands of years ago. So it makes more efficient the writing and the reading. And then we have more conventional visualization, bars or line graphs or percentages, proportion bars, right? Because now it's different how you interpret the numbers. Maybe these are percentages or proportions with respect to a certain reference, typically 100, or maybe both are part of a sum, of a whole, or maybe one is part of the other, right? One is a proportion of the other, etc. Right? So I'm gonna just continue moving around, showing some. Yeah. And I do this sometimes when I do a workshop. I do this like an activity, and people have some time, 15 minutes or so, to create their own ways and to be just creative and find things. And there are always new ways. And this is 2 numbers, right? So imagine any other data set, like with dates and geographic coordinates and different number lists, and it's just not 2 data points, but thousands of them. So the possibilities multiply and open very quickly. And the message here, I guess, is that whenever you have a data set, there's no one single way to visualize it. That's the first idea. And there's no ideal way to visualize a data set. It's a lot of human decision there, a lot of arbitrarity or good choices or purpose or motivation or direction or bias or whatever you want, but it's really not just a technical decision. It's much more than that. And again, this is just 2 numbers. The last in my list is fat fonts. It's an interesting invention in which it is not mine, by the way, in which the number itself has a a black surface proportional to the number.
Mm.
So it circles back to, it's at the same time notation and visualization in the more conventional sense. So 75, this is 75% black, this is square, and this is 37% black, this square over here. Okay. So yeah, the number of options, it's of course huge, and I believe this is just the beginning of the list. It could continue growing a lot. Another thing that languages should do well is that they are good for talking or representing any kind of reality. This is how language serves different culture, all different cultures through times. Like it needs to be useful for talking about fishing, but also emotions, but also relationships, or also what is going to happen tomorrow or what happened yesterday. So it has to be able to address not just a few realities. It has to be able to address any reality. So I created a list, I curated a list. I asked people I know about things that are important in life, right? And they told me things. I wrote down those words. So I curated a list, 32 words that I selected, very diverse stuff, of course. And then I tried to find a visualization project that fitted each of those words. So if visualization really can address any reality, I will find a project for each of these words. Let me read some of the words. If you have universe, colors, trade, opinion, family, art, history, stars, economy, science, religion, sex, brain, genes, evolution, food, war. Okay, so these are a few of the words I collected, and then I indeed went over my own bookmarks and then asking on Twitter, etc. And it wasn't so difficult to find a project that fitted well each of those words. So the spectrum of realities that visualization can address is really big. As you can see, there is diversity in the, and not just in the texture of the reality it represents, from soccer to stars, planetary stuff, to map, to interesting words over there.
Sorry. Marinis, can you please mute everybody if possible? Thank you very much.
There's also texture in colors, so differences in colors and visualization kind of approaches, like techniques, etc. So let me just open one of these. This is you find this project in moebio.com. You go there, it's universe, live universe, and everything else. And you can go here and choose your project and open each of these projects. This is an old project, so some are not working, I guess, but let me open the one I really wanted to open now is this over here. The one about books, because it's connected with my talk today, my presentation. So choose your own adventure books. You might know about them. They also arrived to Colombia, to Bogota when I was a kid, and I loved those books, of course. The non-linearity. Someone made a very complete analysis of many of those books, right? And made all sorts of analysis, visualizations, all the paths and the statistics. Some books had actually very few possible endings. Others were packed with possibilities. And yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm gonna already also comment on something that I'm gonna be talking later, which is the problem of why books are linear. This is one question I have. Why books are linear? This is of course an exception, right? This kind of books, but this is the exception that confirms the rule, because these are well known because they are nonlinear, right? So this is why they are different from the others, but most of the books are to some extent linear, are at least from the syntactic perspective. They start with a word and they end with a word, and then there is an unambiguous order for those words. There's nothing else, again, with some very few exceptions that people might know, and maybe most of the people know this case, and that's it. So that's a question I have, and I didn't find any satisfactory answer, because our brains, from a physiological perspective, are not linear. From a process perspective, at least it doesn't seem they are. It seems they are not linear. It seems that everything is closer to the idea of a network than something that is just a sequence. So this is a question I've been having for years, right? Okay, so indeed, visualization seems to be able to address many realities. Now, another thing the language has is that it's similar but different, is that it's universal. It's not a niche, because one might think that visualization is like a technical endeavor and only technical people can produce and understand and read visualization, and whereas other people less academic or less technical, or maybe kids, will then naturally arrive to produce or read or find interesting visualization. So I've been exploring that as well in different ways. This, for instance, is a fantastic example that I like a lot. This is a mother of a kid sent me this when she saw one of my projects. I did a sort of visualization of characters in the Iliad, and it has some similarities in terms of geometry to this drawing that this mother saw his kid doing. So she sent me this, and she asked me, should be worried or not? And actually she was very proud of and the thing is that it's a 10 years old kid at the time. He loves the Avengers comics, and he produces this graph of his interest for characters through comic books. And this breaks a lot of conventions, and I like that a lot. And this introduces some things that are, in my opinion, are extremely advanced. The first thing that is remarkable, different from most of the visualization projects I know, including all the 32 we saw before, is that he's not representing like data this person found in the world. He's representing his own interest or emotions or behaviors through time. So it's subjective data visualization. In my opinion, it's still something yet to happen. And it's a new world, in the same sense that we went from visualizing, let's say, objective and hard realities, numbers coming from sensors, and then we start learning that also culture could be also a source of material for visualization. Now I think the future is you can visualize yourself and your ideas and your emotions, to the point that visualization is or could be a language, because it's also a means of self-expression, not just a way to try to represent an external reality. So this is very interesting in that regard. I've done a lot of workshops with kids in visualization, or with interactive contents, or teaching kids to code, things like that. These are my two sons, and I was exploring ideas around data science and trying to see, because some machine learning algorithms, in my opinion, are things that humans already do all the time, right? There might be other machine learning algorithms that are very anti-intuitive or difficult to understand, etc., but some are really obvious And this for instance, what I did here is I gave this template, and they have to choose colors for the empty circles, right? That was the first part, the first level of the exercise. It's easy to color by intuition. In some cases, it will be more difficult than in others. But the second level was ask them, what was your criteria for choosing a color? And they had to think hard. And obviously the first answers were kind of unstructured. So I pushed them into elaborate a more structured answer until they arrive to the KNN algorithm. We just take the closest dots and we make a votation. And at the end, it's interesting how humans can also go through processes, algorithms really. Sometimes we call those heuristics. And then we don't know what we just did, but then there was a way to explain what we just did. And explaining what we just did is another level of skill. So it's different. So it was very interesting. These kind of exercises with kids are very interesting. The decision tree, which is another very different algorithm, is also extremely intuitive. It's part of what kids also use in their games for guessing an object with questions, things like that. It's a decision tree. So I'm very interested in those very intuitive algorithms that we constantly use, and now we think it's just for data scientists, but everyone uses it. So the universality of data, right? And of course, if data or data visualization is a language, it should be used to tell stories, right? And this can be featured in so many different ways. I choose to show today a project I created, but there are so many other projects around that are aimed to use data to somehow, yes, tell stories. This is data from a site called Lostpedia. It's a fan-based wiki that contains all the scripts from the Lost TV series, all the seasons, 6 seasons. And it was very easy to take the data, and it was already quite well structured. I didn't have to mine it too much. I took the data, and the names were very consistent. So extracting the names of the character was easy. Then I also extracted pictures from all the characters. And the good thing about this is that once you represent it, at least in this first linear way, it's like you can actually read it, like if it was a comic book. Like I have the dialogues here, and I also have the structure of acts, scenes, dialogues. So I read a couple of episodes this way, and it's readable. And I like this idea that there is a reality, then you extract the data, and then you reconstruct somehow the reality, and you retell it through the data. So it's really telling the story again through this kind of mechanism. But of course, this is the linear representation, which is just one way, and maybe the least interesting way to work with this data. So something that I like a lot about data visualization, I mentioned at the beginning that two extremely different realities build similar data set that end up with almost the same visualization technique. There's also the opposite. One single data set could be, and I already made the point, could be represented in so many different ways, right? And this is what I explore here as well. In this case, like finding the network of connections episode by episode, and not just representing the network, but also like I can click on a connection and see the history of the relationship between, in this case, between Kate and Charlie, the co-occurrences, this kind of stuff. And because all of you have worked with similar data, I know you can imagine so many other things that can be done, right? It's infinite. Like if I choose just to see how two characters connect, there are so many other analyses and visualizations that can be done. This is just a glimpse of what can be done, right? And one of the things about network that I like is that you have this dual way to represent them as graphs or as the adjacent matrix. I like it because formally speaking, or as an aesthetic, is radically different. In a way, it's like an opposite archetype. And I stress in this project this difference by choosing a sphere, which is the epitome of the roundness and organic. And then you go to this very square perpendicular representation, and it's the same. At the end of the day, you have the same thing, the same ideas. Here you have the relationship between two characters through time. So it's interesting. You can go, by the way, episode by episode. In the Zoom, it's a little bit jumpy. I'm sorry. Yeah, but I think everyone gets the point. Of you can interpolate in your brains. I don't know if you can, but
maybe
you can try.
What it means when the images are wider.
Yeah. So yeah, many decisions like this one that sometimes are not even explained. You can guess them or not. Easter eggs, if you want. Is just the freak is how much this character appears in this particular episode.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And the size of the connection. And you see only the length of the Venn diagram, which was also a kind of a visualization decision until you roll over. The size is also how much they connect, how much they appear independently, etc. And the sizes are interesting because you can analyze, as I've done, some kind of scripting techniques. In particular, Lost is very interesting because they explore all sorts of script techniques, and you can see that through different seasons. And so a typical thing they do is that the first episode of a new season is what is called a choral episode, in which almost all the main characters will have the same wave, and almost all possible interactions will happen, right? So that sets up like the base for the next stories that will probably be focusing on specific characters, sometimes even just two characters. It's not the case here. This is the second episode of the last season, but this one, the third episode, goes into Locke, right? Locke and Sawyer. So you can feel and start. It's what I call visual analytics, which is this kind of patterns, but through the eye and through movement, as opposed to just statistics. But it is statistics. It tells you how many episodes are more choral than others, etc. Right? But it comes from through the eye. And finally, an idea that I think it's also very interesting and stresses the point of data visualization can tell stories is that this technique that I call reenactment, which is again like being able to represent the show. Here in Zoom is super jumpy, so it's more difficult to understand what's going on. I can modify the speed here, and you can also like see the show this way, see an episode. And to tell the truth, because I saw this way a couple of them, is not so different than seeing it on TV, because even in TV, it's your mind that is creating the stage, even in TV. And using data to rebuild the story is a way to test that. How much I lost if the only thing I have is an image for the character and the content of the text, in this case, some notion of time. In this case, the timing is driven by the length of the text. I don't have the timestamps from the dialogues. So what I do is the longer the text, the more I wait. And with that it creates a sort of interesting organic timing that makes this very readable, right? So yeah, so telling stories with data. So I think that's a few arguments, maybe it's just that, it's just a few arguments in the direction of data visualization being a language. The last one really is about knowledge, right? Because you use language to communicate stories, of course, and actually stories probably, if we think from an evolutionary perspective, are the main drivers of knowledge by themselves, but to some extent, knowledge can be shared without having to tell a story around, and maybe this is more modern, right? And more in scientific cultures, I don't know. What I know is that if we look at data visualization as a tool for communicating knowledge, there is a lot of things that can be done there. And again, I could have chosen among many projects, and I'm going to show one of my projects. Right? The data I'm using here is from my bookmarks. I used to use a lot Delicious back in the day, but that platform closed, and now I use Pinboard. Actually, I exported all the Delicious bookmarks into Pinboard, and I continue using Pinboard. I think very few people nowadays use these kind of tools. But what it does is that when you bookmark a website in the system, besides the URL and a description, you put tags. And there was a time, like, I don't know, 15 years ago, where a lot of people were very excited about tags. And now I feel I am the last to be excited about that. And people used to talk people used to talk about folksonomy and internet, in which all the content will be connected by people, not by platform, not by companies, right? Not by tools. It's more like independently of the tool, if you have contents and you put tags around those contents, those are like connectors that will lead you to other contexts that are related, and it's like a self-emerging structure for the internet. And instead of that, we got Google, which is a little rectangle with you find, and Google gives you what they want for you coming from this particular search, right? So it's very disappointed in that regard, as opposed to freely navigate. But it has to do with my question about linearity and the rant that is important in this that motivates this conversation is, again, the expectation of humans interacting in more linear ways, and always the linear tools winning, right? That's a little bit my feeling. Like, why is that? That internet is a network, but it ends up being used through an extremely linear tool that is Google, right? This is kind of what I'm trying to understand and trying to explore as a way to find alternatives to tell stories, to etc. Right? So in this case, this is a 7 sets Venn diagram. So you can intersect multiple categories among 7 categories in this case, like networks, humanism, technology, language, science, interface, and art. These are arbitrary. These are the ones I choose for organizing my contents. And then the tags will tell me where those contents are placed, are based, and I have Wikipedia pages, I have projects, I have books, etc. Right? I even have my own project, so it's interesting that I can see where they are placed in this map and what are the neighbors. And this, by the way, is related with some conversation we had before about dimension reduction. This is, in a way, also a technique for dimension reduction. A little bit different, but it is that as well, because it's a multidimensional categorical space, not numerical. But you have to put it in a screen because that's what you have, in 2 dimensions. So how to do that? In this case, well, 7 sets Venn diagram is not the most common way to do it, but it's possible, right? It's I didn't invent it or discover the 7-set Venn diagram, but I found someone that discovered one, but it was super difficult to understand visually. And I did invent a new version in which areas are more or less the same for all the intersections. So it's a balanced 7-set Venn diagram, okay? Except in this case where I put the cursor on top, and this is a technique in which I think the cursor is a sort of proxy of my eye or my eyes. So where I move, there is this transformation, this geometric transformation that makes contents around more visible. Okay, so knowledge can be shared, can be expanded. I would like, if I do a second version of, or if I involve this project, what I would love to do is to make it collective, as opposed to just one person. That's boring. One person and his or her bookmarks. It will be awesome to see collective, right? Like a team. Like if all of you, for instance, share your research through bookmarks and how you tag it, or maybe there are no tags involved, but descriptions, maybe a space in which you can indeed find connections across things that different people are interested or you have done that. You did something that you mapped, you ask about different references, and you try to put in a, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what is interesting, because this I know, and yes, there is some serendipity here for me. I discover things, but it's still my bookmark, so boring. Something collective will be, no doubt, much more interesting. The matrix. You use a matrix instead of a, okay.
That is also very good.
Okay, so that's the idea of visualization as a language, and I will try to say more. I really think that because data is becoming so important in so many different ways, and also because it's getting closer and closer from public attention from different angles, including what's going on with companies that use personal information, and more people are starting to become more aware of that, and people might ask themselves, what is really that data that I radiate that other organizations are taking advantage and I am not, etc. Or maybe because what happened with the COVID, a lot of people that were not used to follow like certain kinds of graph, starting understanding a new language of dealing with time series, in particular the logarithmic scale. Many people learn the logarithmic scale thanks to COVID and certain graphs that use it, or the fact that countries at the beginning, the first months, you might remember the graphs used to have like an independent, or they unify the starting point depending on the number of the first certain number of cases in a given country. And all those things are very abstract, and people nonetheless, because they were very motivated, started understanding those otherwise difficult visual devices. So many things are going on around data, and because, as I made the point, data can be used as a means, as a language, a means for self-expression, for exploring the world, knowledge, etc. I feel like the possibility of data becoming the next cultural industry. Like if you see different media through time and how they evolve, and then they open the possibility of a new cultural industry, data is following a similar pattern, right? So I think that's possible, but it's still a big question, and it also has to do with non-linearity and networks, because I think the opportunity here is that it's also for our culturalists to learn to be capable of dealing with non-linearity, and that's a challenge for sure. So this is too big a topic for me to really say something really meaningful. The only thing I can do is to point to certain ideas around it, right? And to show some phenomena. That's the only thing I could do. So let's work on this idea that numbers is different from numbers, or this is my way to say that even if you work with a data set that is made out of just numbers or mainly numbers, I don't think the important thing about this data are the numbers themselves. It's other things that are important and interesting and relevant for humans. So I'm gonna explain that through a project, also a project I created, and this is S&P 500 companies and some data about earnings. I'm just picking up some companies. And Hewlett Packard over here. Let me see if I find something more recognizable. Verizon, I don't know. So each company is like a little snake there. It's a connected scatter plot, and you see the x-axis is the earnings through time. No, it's the earnings in a logarithmic scale, and the y-axis is the taxes paid by the company in terms of percentage, and linear. And you see Apple over here, for instance, the one most in the right, is getting more and more earnings, except last year, at least from the data I have here, it went up and to the left. So less earnings, a little bit more of taxes, right? And each company has its own little snake in that connected scatter plot. But what I do on the right is I don't care about the actual numbers. I care about the pattern. So I can compare different stories in a sort of fair way, right? Putting the little snake in a square, so normalizing. And that way I can think in terms of pattern, not numbers. And so for instance, Hewlett Packard, it didn't do very well because it started paying more taxes and earning less, right? Whereas Apple, well, as I described. And the other thing is that when you think in patterns.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you are losing the most essential information over there when we're going from the left to the right. Compare, for example, Apple and Northrop.
Yeah.
For Apple, if you look at the thing on the left-hand side, you understand that the vertical dimension is essentially zero. So all the changes in the taxes are completely irrelevant, while Northrop started paying like twice more taxes, or 1.5 more taxes during this time, and you cannot see it. You can have, well, essentially the same pattern on the right, but completely different stories on the left.
Yeah, because its story is normalized respect to itself, and that on purpose you lose that. And what you get is just a pattern without any numerical reference.
Yes, but my point is that the pattern with no numerical reference might be irrelevant, and numbers are relevant.
You might find that the patterns, the information you're missing is relevant for certain things. But you can never say that something is irrelevant because I only need one thing that is relevant, and you cannot think about all the possible things that are relevant that you are not seeing. You just identify one purpose and you realize that this particular approach is not relevant for that purpose because you already identify a purpose. But you don't know what many other purposes could be served by this approach. That's the point. Of course, it's about breaking things that are normally very useful, right? It's about, for instance, being able to say, okay, I don't care the amount of tax. I just care about the direction, right?
Why would you? Why anybody would care?
So if I understand right, so at Apple, you say in the grand scheme of things, tax-wise, nothing changed, which is true.
Yeah.
But in the boardroom, in the non-presence of mathematicians and physicists and quantifiers, still somebody said, like, last year we paid less taxes. We have to, now we need to pay more. We need to change that. Or at Northrop, even though there was basically no difference in earnings, people may actually say, yeah, we made more last time. And so that kind of like qualitative sentences is what you capture in here. And we all have seen papers in computer science or from quantitative fields where, from the point of view of physics, computer science, or whatever, that an argument like, X has more than Y is statistically irrelevant because there is less than an order of magnitude difference. But we all also have seen the journalist who goes run and says, X has Y than more, or in this case, Northrop has paid more taxes. I need to call the guy in the Congress and sort of like give him more money privately so we pay less taxes. So the interesting thing is that what you show on the right is indeed, you may say, wouldn't make it into a Nature paper, but is the cause we see stuff happening like bribery in Congress.
If you don't put things in a qualitative kind of speech, it disappears, and it will be just a few technicians in the company being able to talk using the numbers. But the rest of the company cannot talk of those numbers, or they don't care, or they don't understand, or that they forgot about them.
If I tell you that my taxes went up from 13 to 13.5, and his taxes went up from 13 to 30%, you can't say a difference. You don't need to be a technician to differentiate between 0.5 raise of taxes and 20%.
In that very moment in which, yeah.
This is exactly what needs to be. Giving numbers to numbers, like, it might sound big, it might sound small.
Yeah, the thing is that think from a human perspective. You have invested in Bitcoin and you see those numbers, and at the end of the day, the moment you're looking at the screen, those numbers matter a lot. 5 minutes after that is just a feeling in your guts that you feel bad because you saw that going down, or you are like lie because at the end of the day, those numbers disappear. It's just the patterns that merge, because Bitcoin going up or down will not change anything in your life. Anything. Even if you became millionaire, what changes in your life is the relationship you have with your family, with your kids. So in this society, from having $10,000 in your bank account to having $1 million, your life technically changed very little. You are going to what you believe are better holidays, but you will have the same good or bad time that you have in any holiday. It's the same thing. It only matters what happened with your wife, if you fought or not over the kids, or whether the kids behave well. So that's the problem. You obsess on things that seem so important, the numbers, but at the end of the day, it's the patterns that tell you you're going in the right direction, or maybe you move your headquarters to Ireland, so you're paying less taxes. And this qualitative aspect, in my opinion, I wouldn't say explain more than the quantitative aspect, but it's overlooked, constantly overlooked, the qualitative aspect. And now I realize this is a good example here, because in a way, what you do here is you take cultural data and try to put it in quantitative ways. And I'm here taking typical quantitative data and trying to put it in qualitative ways. It's kind of the reverse operation. And yes, I'm not proposing to use this to replace the other approaches, but I'm telling that this approach opens new windows of perception. That's my point. And indeed, it's a lot of origami here, a lot of bending, a lot of, if you will, deformation of the data. So that happens, and a lot of information is lost. That for sure. But let's see if the next steps help on my argument or not. But let's say you are wanted to see whether other companies follow a similar pattern like Apple, right? So you click on Apple, and indeed it shows you other. And to your point, look the differences. The quantitative differences are radical, not just because the vertical and horizontal spans are very different, but also the positions in this connected scatter plot, right? It's very different, 1 million than 100, right? But again, from the pattern perspective, they are very similar, Apple and Tiffany. And maybe, just maybe, there are reasons that are more qualitative, like policies and CEO or board decisions that are common across these companies. I don't know, right? Finally, you can draw your own pattern to find companies that follow that pattern, right? So you can.
So there's plenty of scientific fields where people are just interested in angles and not in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like in biology, protein folding, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Where you, like in our case, qualitative, quantitative, you can go the other direction too, right? Do you think that this is a mutual issue where like people sort of, like in different fields, we underestimate the importance of qualitative pattern, while in other fields we overestimate numbers? And should this be really together?
I would say in general, numbers are overestimated.
Okay.
Yeah, because people don't realize that if they look at themselves, they will say that at the end of the day, those numbers didn't matter, that it was always a reference game. Do I earn more than my neighbor? That's what they care about, not the number, the exact number of how much they earn. It's always comparisons with references they create in their minds, in our minds, with references we have around.
Mm-hmm.
What is the meaning of being successful, of being rich, of being healthy, right? Etc. It's always referential. And in general, especially in the business world, everything goes through the specific numbers. Even in physics today, I think the numbers, for instance, the universal constants, are losing weight because physics is more about patterns and relation, especially when you start thinking about multiverses, in which there could be universes with different values for the constants. So the constant themselves stop being the relevant thing. But there is a dance between those constants. There are some intervals in which, with a little bit of change in certain values, the universe is not viable or is not viable for life. Exactly. And those relations are very important.
There are two things I want to in relation to this. On the one hand side, what you are talking about is called topology. Yes. So basically, we know there are loads of physical phenomena which are related exactly where you don't care about concrete numbers. You care about how the space, in what sort of space your patterns, what is the relational positions of things. And on the other hand side, the example you made shows that numbers matter, because it is exactly for these particular values of world constants that we are able to see here. If there is, we can imagine a universe existing with slightly different constants up to, I don't know, third decimal numbers, fourth decimal number, but we won't be able to survive in that conditions. So for our survival here and now, it is absolutely relevant that the ratio, for example, of the mass of proton to mass of electron is exactly what it is.
The amount of dark energy.
Different from that.
Yeah. Indeed, but the important thing is that you can tell that idea.
Yes. Yeah.
And you didn't mention the number. Because for that idea, the number on itself is not so relevant. What is relevant is that the variation is minimal to destroy the universe, right?
Yeah, but still you understand that there is this concept of minimal variation.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what I wanted to happen. So like put these difficult questions here, because I myself struggle a lot all the time on that as well. I think it's it's I have this feeling that you can explain the universe only through patterns and in nonlinear ways. But obviously, I crash against walls all the time, but I keep trying, right? Okay. Some thoughts about time representation as well in the exploration of nonlinearity. I think, for instance, when you read a book, yes, it's true that the words are it's a series of words in an unambiguous sequence, but every time, like, this is the way I imagine, a word crashes into your mind, it immediately has a very large number of connections with every other word you already read from that text, not just with the past one. So maybe the strong connection is with the last word, but the real meaningful connection is everything that you read before, even words that you no longer remember. And nonetheless, something magic happens in your brain that it creates connection, and you start building a universe in your head. It's amazing that, for instance, you can communicate knowledge about physics through textbooks, because it's like you are telling so much about the universe, and it's just a sequence of letters. It's crazy. And for sure, nonlinearity has a lot to do with that, all those connections. But this is not a line. I don't think is the right way to. Is more like a network in your brain. Right. Some people fancied other metaphors for time, like the classic spiral, right? The idea that everything comes back, but in a different way. This is a metaphor that you can find in philosophy, but also some people naively talk about spirals when talking about time, and then the idea of protein, that there are some stronger forces between certain nodes that make, like, right, collisions or clusters, like UMAP, that forces harder, like clusters, things like that, right? So the time, right? So one experiment I did was taking the histogram, which is a classic timeline created in the early 30s, a visualization of different empires through the world since I think the past is over here.
Yeah. What would be on the
No.
y-axis? Oh, sorry, on the
Yeah,
x-axis.
y-axis, from here. A little confused reading the numbers, and yeah, because it's before Christ. Yeah, of course. So time goes like this. And what I did was I deformed the map, so it became, in a way, more similar to how I think humans, and not just humans, because there's something called entropy in the universe, but every system perceives information. The more it goes farther in the past, the less you know and you can know about, yes, because you have a direction of time that second law of thermodynamics put in the universe, right? And so perception also works that way. So it's easy to forget that the Chinese empires were very strong in different times. And it's nice that in this graph that was created in the 30s, China is very small. So
from a Western perspective.
Yeah, exactly for that particular European perspective in that particular year, I don't think they could, you can tell it's gonna grow again.
The horizontal axis.
It's just an organization that I believe loosely follows like a geographic pattern from Asia from Europe to Asia. Although it starts with Asia.
By why, I don't know, Egypt is suddenly.
The size is the size of that empire at that time, the power they have.
The size.
Yeah.
Is,
the share of
the share of what?
Of global wealth.
In geographical terms, or in kind of like some other.
It's not Santiago's map, right?
No, but it's a good question, and I think I knew.
I tried to figure it out.
Yeah.
It's perceived power.
I think it's perceived, relevance, power.
Harvard, Yale.
Subjective perception of power
I think it's measured heuristically. The good thing is that now, and I'm going to show you an idea, is that you can apply other mechanisms to be more objective if you want to measure this. And it's actually the next project I do.
Wait a minute. One thing I would like to comment here, because there's probably no better time to do so. We had a conversation over lunch, which was about the fact that you know, in academia, you always want to do it the first time. You want to do novelty now, and like if somebody has done this in the past, you don't do it. And, but actually, at the same time, academia does all this textbook stuff, and if you do something truly new, you basically don't get it over peer review, and you can convince people. This thing is very classic table lens Xerox lab, right? So you have this hyperbolic lens as you look at a picture in this particular case. And the interesting thing is, so the data source is old, the method is sort of like 1995, but from the perspective of, in this case, Santiago or the user, this is completely, it's a new combination, and it's valid for personal sort of like exploring of the world. You don't care if somebody went that ski slope down before, right? It's not about powder skiing. It's for you, this is now powder, but hundreds of people may have done the same thing. But nevertheless, you actually perceive that map in a completely different way than other people would look at it. This thing, if you study archaeology and nobody took it off the wall because it obviously has problems, Western Chauvinism, this map is probably either somewhere on the wall where nobody ever looks at it. You can't reach on top. You have to bow down to get to the bottom. Or it's in a book as a fold-out thing, which nobody ever folds out if you go to Google Books. Probably they haven't scanned it, but you see, oh, they didn't fold it. So this thing is something which I think there is plenty of opportunities in everyone's project to actually have these kind of like sort of things where you say, yeah, that may not be super groundbreaking, but actually in order to understand what's going on, it's actually very, very useful to do that kind of stuff and basically do combination of things that
combine idea, yeah. So yeah, and the next project I can answer the data question because it's data I gather. I took a similar approach, but I wrangled Wikipedia pages in this case. And what I did is, so here is present, or at least the present of the Santiago that created the project, I believe, I don't know. So this is more or less present, and I parsed the text from each Wikipedia page for each of these years, right? And I think, yeah, from 2000 and before, it's for decades. Again, you see this pattern of entropy, and then centuries, and then centuries still, and then millennia, right? To the Paleolithic, or down to the Paleolithic. And for each website, I just did a TF-IDF analysis, so text frequency inverse document frequency, to take the most interesting or more relevant words in each page. So this is kind of similar to the other one, except that I had this more objective or a way to extract the data. It's still Wikipedia. It's still Western, mainly Western perspective of the history of the world, of course, right? And something interesting is that you have Wikipedia pages for the future. Words that appear here come more from fiction works that predicts stuff that will happen, or maybe eclipse that will happen at certain year, etc. So it's interesting in that regard. But yeah, I like to think about the elasticity of time and how if you go farther in the past, you also have to take larger amounts of time to gather information, of course. Right? And finally, from the time perspective and nonlinearity, this archetype of the history of humankind as a spiral. In this case, it's a school that has been working under that analogy, like, is a foundational analogy for them. They do see human history as a spiral, and they see like a student's evolution as a spiral as well. And what they do is interesting because they match like the student's personal evolution and learning evolution with humankind, like jumps in complexity levels and in societal organization, etc. So they put these two things together and they create a sort of timeline for the student that goes in hand with the timeline of humankind. And so they have all the data about very, very complete data, the curriculum with all these are units of learning, all that they teach, organized through time references for humankind, but also time references for the particular student, right? So it's very, this is a school that teaches complex dynamics and network analysis. It's part of what they teach even for kids. It's very interesting. They are very interested in complexity. Yeah, education is something that I won't talk today, but when I talk about nonlinearity, I also think a lot about how we, in our culture, how we teach and how we are very linear with everything. Also, when we were in lunchtime, we talk about how math is being taught in schools, and there is this idea that there is a line for things that go in mathematics. I personally, my kids, they learn first fractals, cellular automata, and all those things before even dealing with algebra. And I believe all those things are easier than algebra, really. And now they have a vision of mathematics that is different. So when they see numbers, they have a different approach to numbers as well. And they start more intuitively to try to find patterns in the numbers and not just the numbers themselves, right? But it's an infinite subject, education, of course. Now I go into more specifically into networks. And here I'm going to start sharing some problems I found through time when trying to use network to tell the stories. And I believe this will ring a bell for many of you as well that have, if you look at all the posters here, you see you have been producing networks, right, as outputs, as results. And you have for sure found that these are great for certain purposes, but very problematic for others, right? Let's see. I'm going to start with Rayuela. Hopscotch is a book by Cortázar, which is an attempt to break also linearity. It's a book you can read in two different ways. It has a lot of little chapters with numbers, and the author gives you two ways to read it, or proposes two ways, right? Like the linear way, or you can follow the advice and jump to number. So it's a different book. But the book, the instructions or the introduction is in its own way. This book is many books, but mostly it's two books. And in my opinion, the author is already suggesting that you might have more than two. And I also believe, I sincerely believe, that it's so entangled that most of the people get lost in the numbers, and at some point it will be lost and will be read another book that was not. And I think the author knows that. Sometimes there are crazy jumps. It makes it very difficult. So I wanted to, of course, visualize that. This is the linear sequence, right? And you can actually read the chapter here. So it's also a device for reading the book. And you can jump using the sequence, the linear sequence or the nonlinear sequence, right? And you can close it. And if you zoom out, you see the network. Again, zoom is a little bit jumpy, but the idea is that you see the flow of the nonlinear book, and you can zoom in and see a little bit more closer. and it's you take a look into the, let's say, the topology of this alternative path for the book, and with some interesting patterns. And there is a chapter. Let me see if I find it.
Is there a self-loop chapter?
Sorry?
Is there a self-loop chapter?
That's a fluke chapter.
That would be a nightmare for
I think. Well,
there is a separate story by the same author, which is
self-loop.
It's yeah, there are a lot of loops in Cortázar narrative, and no, but there is a chapter, trying to find it, that it doesn't make the second book. It's not part of the second book. I lost it, and when I read it following the sequence, I felt into a loop. I did. I am reading this again or not. I don't know, because maybe Cortázar started another chapter with the same words. I don't know, and I was so yeah.
it was
So, yeah.
I think he would do it.
Yeah, he could do that. Yeah. So yes, networks. Although this is not, it is a network, but it's like two paths. It's a network, and we have this that it's very, again, from the 30s. Again, a diagram from the 30s by Alfred Barr. Max knows much more about this diagram than myself. We talk a lot about it because at some point I had it in my hands, and my wife look at it and say, nice ball. And I say, what bull? And yeah, there is a bull over here. And I don't know. I sincerely don't know if it is on purpose or not. And the clue that tells me this is on purpose is cubism by the horns. It's too suspicious. I don't know. Which of you believe it was on purpose? Half and half. Yeah, thank you. No. Yeah. It's difficult to tell. I don't know. So this is a friend of mine drew that. This is Picasso. Yeah, fits too well. And they did this, and it was the cover of a Leonardo issue. This little thing, and thanks to Max that pushed.
There's a pre-drawing which has Picasso at the cubism.
This
So
one?
it was intentional.
Yeah.
No, you don't know that.
No, I think it was intentional.
You think, but there's no historical reference, and I read. Well, what was the name of the expert? That's
Astrid book.
Astrid.
Yeah.
She never saw that. Tofty has a long text about this diagram.
Yeah,
he didn't.
He's
see
not a historian. The thing is that there is pencil drawings by Alfred Barr, which are the basis for the poster.
But I saw those, and I didn't see any book.
But I think it's clear with if you look at the labels and stuff. Yeah,
It's interesting. It's in half
should
and half.
unpack the project.
So yeah, interesting. So networks stories, this like constellation is in a way a reference in that regard, a very ancient reference, because in multicultural. This is Western perspective of the sky and how we connect dots and what stories we project into those connections. It would be more like this from our perspective, right? You have the Cruxis over here, Scorpio, etc. But again, patterns, but patterns in this case illusory, like fake patterns, in the sense that it's like dimension reduction. We see things that are close because it's exactly dimension reduction, although it's not a PCA. It's a bad dimension reduction in the sense that they are projecting on 2 dimensions, in this case over the surface of a sphere, things that could be very far apart. And we look at them, look, these 2 stars are close one to each other. No, they are not, or maybe they are, but you don't know. So playing with those ideas, I created those little.
Some of them don't exist.
So you can change from and also the size is the apparent magnitude, right, of the star. And maybe that's not the real magnitude, because it's a combination of maybe being too close or maybe being too big. You don't know, right? So I'm going to change now to absolute magnitude and the real actual three-dimensional positions of the stars. But let's see. Yeah. Then you have, and this is for me like a little poem about representation and maps. If I go to the center, I kind of recover the human perspective, right?
Would be nice to look at the sky from each of the stars.
Yeah, change the center and see what constellation and how they, yeah, and that will be certainly possible. Yeah. Question for you: why is that?
Well, there are very many stars which we don't see from here, and if you take something which is like 100 light years away, then they will have a lot of close stars which we do not see at all. So you can easily reposition these same stars on the sky or something.
The farther you go from the sun, the more cluster will be all the stars, right? That's interesting. Why is that most of the bigger stars are outside and not close to the center? I like to do representation puzzles, and this is one of those representation puzzles. Why is that?
Well, because there are much more space far away, number one. And number two, far away you don't see small ones, it's really big.
So they have the advantage of being big, even if they are far away, you can see them. And that's it. And it's another bias in perception for humans in that regard, right? And that story that you have been told that many stars in the sky.
Yeah, but that once again, it's a question of what, just essentially what return to you to what you were saying concerning the first part. So it depends on what is your purpose.
Yeah.
If your purpose is, I don't know, poetical, if your object of study is the night sky on Earth, that knowledge is completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
But if your reference point is astrophysics, if you want to understand how they move, how they interact with each other, then they're completely right.
I think part of what I want to represent here is that movement, or if you wish, the history of modernity in one click. Is going from a narrative world, a mythological world, our self-reference world, right? And then you go to a scientific world in which stories, mythologies disappear, are broken, and you have a sort of objective referential frame. So it's a little bit that what I wanted to do here indeed.
So this is an interesting side note. And Eddie Warburg, who did the Mendelssohn Atlas with Ernst Cassirer, thought about how do we tackle this transition? Like that's exactly what they wanted to do. How do we go from a mythological world where everything can have a spirit and some agency and stuff like that to the modern physical world where we can disambiguate different types of relation, which you already need that kind of stuff. So what they surmise is actually, in order to understand it, they need to understand the mathematical transformation of the real world into our minds, into what they thought is a topological space. So you do exactly that right here, right? So you say, okay, there's one kind of geometry, which is the geometry we see in the sky, which, by the way, star signs are figure 1A in the Mendelssohn Atlas of Eddie Warburg, which is quite fun. And then the second option here is to go to the real geometry. So again, third time today, we are at networks and geometry. So there is a a curious correlation between the two. And so far, when we talk network visualization, we talk about networks, we run some layouts, which Force Atlas 2 is as recognizable as the bull, by the way. So if you look at a G5 Force Atlas 2 network or Fruchtermann-Reingold or whatever string embedded layout you use, you typically can spot in what was done. You look at a network and the first thing you say, oh, this is done in cytoscape, this is done in G5. That's exactly Picasso's bull. But what you want to get to is the actual sort of essence of understanding of the network, and that means you need to sort of understand its real geometry.
Yeah, but this is still a 3D engine.
Of course.
It's still an aesthetic device.
Yes.
So we never get to the real thing if ever that thing existed, right? It's still the decision of representation, right?
But you get closer to reality by breaking sort of the illusion of the star signs, right?
In a way, yeah. And the other thing that I think it's interesting is that you go from one set of archetypes to another. Like the ancient romantic and mythological world is spherical and organic, whereas the modern, and this is stereotypes and archetypes, right? Like whereas the modern perspective of the universe is scattered with points hard, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also an archetype regarding like the feminine and the masculine, etc. So representation always carries those decisions in terms of archetypes, and sometimes are very conscient, sometimes it just happens and you don't know why. But anyways, like thinking about representation, but also thinking about the stories that you can communicate with your representation. So one example here is the herbal. Right? Herbal. Someone in herbal. So the herbal, you know the herbal. We all know the herbal. It's when the data is amazing, lots of connection, but the output, it's at the same time fascinating, and many of us already enjoy this. So you talk about the story of Giphy, and Giphy is a lot about producing herbals that satisfy the eye of the creator of the network, but then when it comes to use that as a communication device, it's very problematic, right? Because it gives you, I think it gives you the pleasure of the structure. That's one thing. At least some of us might find pleasure in building something that has complexity on it. So the complexity satisfies us at least. But then we really want to tell a story or to tell something that this data is, and it's impossible this way, right? It's so many different problems, and this is something that I wanted to share, that problematic. And now I'm going to try to also share some ideas that might help, but I don't think are the definitive answer for sure, right? This is, by the way, from LinkedIn, that at some point in early years allow you to do that with your professional network. So I'm going to share what I believe is a good attempt from I try to tackle many of the problems you find in the herbal. If this is satisfactory result or not, it's up to you. I will point to certain things that help understanding this network. So when you start, what you see is essentially the herbal, except that there is no, you see the herbal. A little bit, yes, you got it. So it starts with the herbal. So one network is this one. It's 1 week. All the Twitter accounts of Twitter employees or internal Twitter accounts at the time, more than 1,000 accounts. So all the people working at Twitter that also happen to use Twitter to communicate through public messages and referencing each other. So I think it's 1,000 nodes more or less, and I don't know, 5,000 connections and maybe 20,000 tweets, something like that. Okay, and the herbal nonetheless already gives you something, which is this idea of, is there a structure or there's no structure? sometimes you try to build a network and it's very homogeneous, it's not interesting. This one over here already points to the existence of clusters, such as this one on the top. And this is the Japanese team, as can be easily detected, right? And this is actually the marketing Japanese team. And the explanation of why they are isolated is very easy. They are in different time frame. They are a particular team, and they also have a separation through language, right? A differentiation aspect. Some of the tweets are in Japanese, not all, but some of the tweets are in Japanese. So it's clear. But by the way, showing this to people at Twitter, we found, or they found, a little cluster over here that they didn't understand at first, why they were close together. I don't remember which ones, maybe this. And then someone that belongs to the cluster say, yeah, these are my fellow smokers. So they meet outside the building and they smoke and they became friends. So it's not a department. And every other cluster is like a department. It's easy to solve and to answer why it is a cluster. So the smokers make a cluster. So that's already something, the fact that you can roll over one single node and see their individual connection and through this color and curve scheme, also the direction, but it's still difficult to read. And one thing that I believe makes network easier to read or more valuable as a device is if you allow to see the local topology, if you will, of a single node, and without having to give up the global, because other tools allow you to do this, but now you lost completely the global. So as I did with the stars, I like to represent two things and to build a continuum that connect these two things. It's not, sometimes it's called an animation, and sometimes it's perceived as a way to just to add some eye catch, I guess. But for me, it's more important because it gives you some reference of where things were before and where things are now. Because if you just change from one state to the other, you cannot check that. Whereas here you say, and then I go back, I see how some nodes take different positions further, etc. So this is the first level of connection, and at least I have the local network. That's something. I can, let me see, I'm gonna go back to the global network. If clusters are the thing that interests me, I run a cluster algorithm and I allow the layout to follow that algorithm. So here we have again the Japanese, I believe, more clearly even. Or let's go back to the forces algorithm. Another thing is that, okay, this network represents data that comes from tweets, and the structure could be interesting, but obviously we would like to see the tweets. So you can choose two nodes and go deeper into the connection. In particular, read the tweets exchange. I think that's very important. And what happens if you don't have, if you don't choose two nodes that actually interchanged or are connected? Let's see what the system does in that case. I connect these two, it finds, well, in this case, a tweet account without thumbnails are not so interesting. Let me connect, because some of the tweet accounts have changed the thumbnail, so the visualization is it has a half-life in terms of images. Each amount of time it loses half of its thumbnails, right? It's entropy again. So this is it finds at least one shortest path between two connected nodes. So what I try to do here is to give some tools to make the network readable in other ways, even in some analytical ways. Okay, and to put algorithms to the service of reading the network, not just analyzing the network. That's more or less what I am trying to do here. And finally, I'm going to leave these two connected. And reenactment, again, because tweets have timestamps. So it makes sense to think how this network behaves through time. So you have a simulation of the data, again, all the tweets through time, and you can see the density. Now is night in the United States, so activity stopped a little bit, and then it resumes and becomes more active, and you see who's writing to whom. Is not really readable in the sense that you get an idea of things going on, but you cannot identify individually the things going on. But it's a first step in an interesting direction of reenacting what happened here. Again, the data oftentimes represents a dynamic reality. Why not try to convey that dynamism, right? In a non-analytical way, in a more recreational way. Okay, so this will be one of the examples of a network visualization in which I try to address the idea of communicating through stories or realities through network, but I still think there's so much to do in that regard, and right now I am receiving, I'm starting to work in different projects for clients, and a pattern I'm seeing might be coincidence, but what I start to see in different organizations is that they are starting to understand that they have to organize their data sets thinking in terms of entities. I think organizations are becoming more mature with respect to data, and they start to better think how they organize data, and they say, in my company, we have different people in the organization that deal with different products, and products are being sold in different retailers, for instance. So they start thinking more narratively in that sense, because they identify the actors and how they are connected, as opposed to a bunch of data, sales data, no, organization. So I am starting to receive more and more requests of, I have this data, I have all these actors, and I need to understand how those actors interact through time or in space, but certainly from a network of actors perspective. And I think this is still very problematic. So I'm trying to find ways to be able to tell the story in a way it makes sense for the people interested in that particular reality or data. And some of the things that I am trying to do now that I haven't done before are more related with how I represent the specific node. So this is one thing, that if you, when the user selects or points to a single, in this case will be just hovering over a single node, if you just get some main information about it, and I jump to another node and I get all other information, that alone is very poor. Like, the node itself could have a lot of information, very rich information, and also contain information about how it connects to other nodes. So you can go down into the node and then from what other nodes connect to that node, you can navigate. That's one idea. Other ideas is that you might want to find linearities within the nonlinear. So if there are threads that are either created or the user can find them and save them, maybe that linearity within the nonlinearity will make easier the life for people to tell stories and to understand what's going on, because indeed our minds still crave for linearity when it comes to understand reality. That's something maybe I have to accept, and maybe that doesn't mean I have to put aside the idea of the network or the nonlinearity. It's just that maybe you have to also put linearities in the system and allow people to find specific stories through and maybe by reading or accessing the different multiple smaller linear stories that also connect, that non-linearities start happening again in their own minds, right? That's something I'm trying to find. Also techniques such as if there are these linear paths, use that reenactment story, but or methodology, but with those stories, so you can again go back to linearity and put play, but it's a linear story that makes sense. This is more or less the kind of thinking, and I'm not alone on that. I'm working with, especially with Daniel Aguilar, which is part of my team. We are trying to find ways to use networks, because we see organizations all over the world trying to tell stories through data that comes in in the shape of a network, in a topology of the network, but they are struggling, and it's very difficult to find. But I think it's a challenge for the next years, and more people will find that challenge. I also see that all of you, or most of you, and most of the projects you have here also face the challenge in one way or another, because your minds are also prone to see data as connected entities, not just an accumulation or not just time series, etc. So with that, I finished my presentation, and I hope I put on the table enough like provocation, etc., for either comments, questions, or debates, or whatever. Okay.
Another question about the immediate thing what you were explaining. I was just wondering if you could give an example of an imposed linearity onto the system.
Yes, in the spiral, in the school project, there are these things called threads that connect contents across different years. And in this school, in the Ross Institute, is very important, because they want the students and also the parents and the teachers to know that when they are learning something, this will come back. This is the idea of the spiral, right? This will come back, but you want to see it from a different perspective. So, and you go along with the same problem, but in different times of history. So these threads are curated by teachers and directors of the school. And then you can select one particular thread and put play. So now you abandon the crazy spiral, hyper-connected network. And now you are in a more regular linear content that makes a lot of sense. And that crosses all the other threads, of course. So that was successful as it goes. It was part of what they already had in their mind. So it was something that was already important even before working on this project, the idea of the thread. So that was one successful story with respect to those linearities within the complexity.
So a bit like the tagging system you were talking about.
I think it's related with tagging, because if someone tags this tag in a way defines at least a subgroup within the complexity. I'm not sure if a thread, in the sense that the order or the sequence is not clarified, but at least the opportunity to extract linearities from there.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to not stop, but I just want to point out we have 17 minutes to discuss, so we went longer. Is this okay?
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. This was super fascinating. Thank you very much. I just want to use the occasion, because we only have a little time. Maybe there is questions from the remote audience. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, also, who else in the room would like to ask a question?
Mara wants to.
Mara, okay. And like, everybody who hasn't spoken yet. Okay, Mara.
Yeah. Well, it was very nice to see again all the works of Santiago. I had seen his works a long time ago. I don't know if you remember, Santiago, we were in this Visualizar and so on.
Of course.
Yeah, and I think that one moment ago, Max, you were saying about, maybe it's not so innovative. I think Santiago is one of the few ones that is doing his own visualization methods. And I think I see a trend that is like, I mean, I teach also from data science, that is a hype now, visualization, and a lot of people use like the libraries that exist, but like, for example, Tableau or D3, and they only use the methods that exist. Mm-hmm. But there is very little people who actually extending these methods or customizing, making innovation out of it. And well, it's quite interesting to see the evolution Santiago. I think also some years ago you tried to make a tool also, right, Santiago, and then you're still using your own tool but didn't publish, I guess, because it's a lot of work, right?
Yeah, I use a personal framework. In 2015, it went open, but it was too much work to maintain it, to keep it. So that disappeared from the open code universe. And also, really, I didn't see too many people interested in using my tools, and it's okay. I continue, working on my own tools all the time.
So thank you very much, Mar, for bringing this up.
Thank you, Mar.
So it was not my intention to state that like whatever Santiago is doing is not innovative. Quite the contrary.
No. But I mean, like what I see when you said is that I think almost each of these visualization that Santiago, this could be in any conference of data visualization, like a case study, of transforming some method with a new case study and actually making little innovations on it. That actually is what actually is innovation, like little changes that actually they are refining the methods and they are like making meaningful ways of exploring the data.
Yes, so actually one of the intentions of inviting Santiago was to make this case that we are somewhat stuck in this tool paradigm, like feels like digital humanities. It's literally all about building tools, like that's what you're tasked to do. And even in like the, sort of most empirical fields, we have things like ready-made toolboxes, tidyverse in R, Vega Lite for doing plots in Python, and so on. And so even you could even say something like processing, right? It's like a ready-made tool set to make it easy to draw circles and lines, while you do this from scratch. And what I find really interesting in this from scratch paradigm is that you don't, like architecture, when they abandoned the classic tools, which is like obviously the column orders of Roman times or whatever, they didn't replace it with nothing, but they went back to geometry and relations and stuff like that. So it's networks and so what I found really, really interesting during your talk is when you said, kids should be taught fractals and like all that stuff, because algebra is actually way harder. And I found that very interesting. When I was in school, we had analytic geometry and algebra side by side, and the teacher could sort of choose what is more weighted. And it always went for algebra because it makes people win out who practice a lot. While there is some people who sort of like think geometrically, and for those, linear geometry is much more awesome because you can imagine a tetrahedron where there's a plane going through which sets up a triangle and what's the center point of that. That's something, if you are working in that aesthetic fashion, you can imagine that. And so it's interesting that you bring that to the table and it's an integrative part of your work. In a sense, you work, I think, often with pencil and paper, maybe even, right? And so that is, I'm surmising that, right? So it's good that you confirm that. So that is something which I just wanted to state as an example for everybody else, that this is also how it can be done. It also can be done in a way where you don't jump from one conference presentation, one journal paper to another, where you fulfill what the crowd wants to have, which is what they already have in their head, while there are so many things that you can do that are also valid. They may not form a linear sequence, like all your projects are not in a linear sequence, right? And you take yourself the freedom to just do them. And I think that is really wonderful because, in academia, I couldn't do the same thing, but I can tell you, you struggle your whole life because people will say, you can't do that. That's not that discipline, or that's not that thing. And so that is something which you exemplified also as a side to this whole thing in a really, really cool way. And I think it's exactly the opposite, Mark. It's the innovation that is sort of the driver of the invitation. So yes, we have 11 more minutes to discuss, and I gave a plenary already. Sorry, Mila.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. Amazing and very inspiring examples that you gave us today. At the beginning of your talk, you said that you were kind of like attempting to break the linearity, and I was kind of like, oh my God, I'm trained as a cultural historian, and I'm kind of like, I think very much in kind of like in linear ways often. But of course, I understand that it's not that we should use, of course, multiple different kinds of like ways to represent data and kind of like to explore the world. So it's not only the linearity that matters, but there are also kind of like different ways to look into that. And I agree with that. And actually when you continued, you proved that, or at least I kind of like interpreted your message in a way that actually the story or linearity is actually very, very strong way of conveying information. Like for instance, you showed these like patterns and kind of like with these different companies. And actually, they are also in a way proto-stories because in a way, the direction shows that, oh, are we doing well or is everything going bad? And that is actually something as, for instance, as I'm studying these pseudo-historical narratives that are circulating, the very core essence of those stories is that my civilization is it going to win or is it going to lose? And what is, so these kind of like very essential stories about the like the identity and the future and the past of my nation, for instance. So in a way, those were also kind of like narrative particles of narrative structures. So in a way, you could show us that there are narratives in what we see narratives in many places. But I started to think that is it somehow possible to kind of like have interesting combinations of like narratives and other kinds of like perspectives. Like as a kind of like historian, I see that there are kind of like, of course there are linear narratives, but then there are breaks into those linearities. Of course, there are different continuities, kind of like very long term, but then there are kind of like shorter term stories or continuities. But then I think that there are also kind of like these pockets. For instance, if we talk about what is medieval time in Rome, for instance, or in Finland, so we're talking about totally different time periods because in Finland we learn to speak or write very much later. So that's kind of like the medieval time started like almost 1,000 years later. or if I have been studying like
so you will put the timeline using a specific individual time reference, similar to what I mentioned about the COVID, in which each country will be in its own timeline compared to the others, because the starting of writing is the time zero for this culture or for this culture, I live from that perspective.
Yeah,
so
kind of like
that's a way to break linearity, similar to what relativity proposes, as there's no universal time frame. You kind of use the same approach to also to cultural studies, dissolving the idea of a universal time frame.
Yeah. Or if you look at like how news circulated in the 19th century, you could see that what was topicality of news was different in different cities, because before the telegram, the news, it would take some time to approach a certain city. So they had kind of like different topicalities at the same time frame. So in that sense, there is, within time frames, there are different kinds of like pockets. So
there's a very famous scene in history of the Louvre burning down, where the telegram spread faster than the news didn't burn down, which was a major thing in the 19th century. So there's actually a really interesting point. These kind of things we now get back into because we look at stuff like walks on a network, right? but many of those have been discussed in the 20s and 30s. Like this is a thing, it's a very infamous term in German art history called the Ungleichzeitigkeit des Gleichzeitigen, which is the non-contemporaneousness of the contemporaneous. So Baroque in Germany is 100 years later than Italy, medieval times is 1,000 years later in Finland and in Venice. And so that kind of stuff is interesting and needs to be revisited. The interesting other thing is that many of those things have already been misused, which is also cool. Like this particular thing was uttered by somebody who was, nowadays for other reasons you wouldn't cite him because, he was 30s Germany. And so in similar ways, you have like Kristalle in geography is a good case, right? Like central place theory. Kristalle was also the guy who worked for Adolf Hitler to do sort of like regional planning in the conquered East Europe. So the interesting thing is like now people use it in cell phone studies, but in the humanities, nobody uses the guy because of its data cost. But it's interesting to take a look and say, oh, okay, so maybe they were up to something with that, but then they misused it, whatever they found. Like central place theory turns out to be true. The same is true with non-contemporaneousness of the contemporaneous. And now, one major difference exists. We have a lot of data, so we can actually take a look. Now, one question I think that I would like to raise in this circumstance, we talked a lot about narrative, we talked about non-linearity, linearity, and stuff like that. So in the network of possibilities, a narrative is a walk that has some direction, that maybe doesn't loop back into itself. So there turns out to be one magic thing in network science, which turns out to be the random walk. It seems to be better than anything else. It's not better for one particular purpose, but if you want to solve many different community finding problems, and you always use a random walk, you win out. Like if you have a hill climbing algorithm, there is no hill, you have a bad day. If you have a valley searching algorithm and there's no valley and only hills, you have a bad time. If you use a random walk, you get valleys and hills, whatever happens. And so the question is, are we just reverting to something where there's a language issue going on, I think. On the one hand, we have narrative, and on the other hand, we have sort of these kind of walks. And should we really equate the two things? Is there something where, like walking through a book, for example, is this really non-linear, for example, right?
In a project I'm working with data from artists, artworks, and cultural spaces in Bogota. One of the ideas is to use random walks as a way to automatically let the system express itself. And it's particularly convenient for an exhibition space because it's just, and it's like free TV. Yes. In the sense that you have infinite content just by hope. But to do this well, I think the key is more in the connection than in the node. Because if you tell a good story that justifies jumping from an artist to a work that was exhibited in this space, as it happened in this space, you also found this interesting art piece, and then if the connection across nodes is well done, well explained, and people can enjoy the connection, not just these random walks could be amazing. And this is, actually, I forgot to comment the idea of the random walk because it was one of the ideas to find narrative within a network. I think it could be, but again, you have to do it in a way, it's not just artist, piece of art, amazing, a space where you have, and just jumping from node to node. You have to somehow, the algorithm and the information you have about the connection has to stress why you are jumping from one node to another. You do that well, I believe it could be a sort of infinite content generator if you have a huge network.
So here again, we're 1910 as Coursera. It's not about the structure, it's about the function. So it's about not nodes, but the links, which is interesting. So we have done this switch in network science 20 years ago, but in humanities, we still have to make it because we're still about texts, we're about paintings, we're about films.
I think I've read, or maybe it was even me that wrote that the connection is the new node. is one way to put it. And mathematically speaking, a network, you can
exactly.
reverse it. You
Exactly.
can reverse it. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
It doesn't make any different from mathematical perspective.
Okay, so time's officially over in 60 seconds. So there's plenty more questions. We will hang out, which is awesome. So sorry for everybody who's not online. So we will go for dinner later today, and everybody who's online, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.